What if a single color e-ink device could replace your notebook, your books, and your tablet? That's exactly what the Boox Note Air 5C sets out to do. It reads like a Kindle, writes like a Remarkable, and runs apps like a Galaxy Tab, all while competing head-to-head with other color e-ink tablets like the Remarkable Paper Pro, the Boox Tab X C, and of course its predecessor, the Note Air 4C. With Android 15 and Google Play, a redesigned pen, improved writing feel, brighter Frontlight, and a redefined user interface, the 5C promises to be Boox's most versatile and future-proof e-ink device yet. And while the upgrades might look subtle, they could bring the Note Air lineup one step closer to providing the ultimate all-in-one e-ink device. But make no mistake, the Note Air 5C has some big shoes to fill. The 4C was the best e-ink all-rounder you could get, and one of the easiest Boox recommendations I've made over the years. So the real question is, are these changes enough to justify an upgrade, or is this just a new coat of paint? At first glance, you might be tempted to say it's just cosmetic, because the 5C keeps the same design as previous Note Air models. But honestly, that's a smart move. In my opinion, it's one of the best designs in the industry. The asymmetrical grip makes it easy to hold without touching the screen, whether you're right or left-handed, and the rounded edges give it a really pleasant feel in the hand. At 440 grams, it's about 20 grams heavier than the 4C, noticeable and now slightly above average for a 10-inch e-ink tablet. The frame is still unibody aluminum, but there are a couple of small updates. Now you get pogo pins on the back for an upcoming keyboard cover and new volume buttons on the right side. I can't talk about the keyboard cover just yet, but I do have thoughts on those buttons. And first, physical buttons are always a win. They bring back some tactility and flexibility that a lot of companies have sacrificed over the years. These are clicky, satisfying to use, and you can assign them to turn pages or trigger different long press actions like refreshing the display, enabling the free mark feature, or launching an app, which is all great. But they do rattle slightly, which takes away just a bit from the otherwise premium build. The bigger issue though is their placement. While they're conveniently located for your thumb, they limit how you rotate the tablet and also interfere a bit with the new pen. The official product images show the pen placed just below the buttons, which makes sense, but the magnets at that position are a bit weaker than on the 4C. Strangely, if you place the Boox Pen 3 a little higher, right in the middle, the magnets are much stronger. It snaps into place so securely, it actually feels like that's where it's supposed to go. But if you attach it there, it presses the volume down button, which is awkward. And that leads us straight to the pen. To get it out of the way, it's still using Wacom EMR technology. So it's passive and doesn't need to be charged, and can be easily replaced by any compatible EMR pen if you prefer something else. That said, the new Boox Pen 3 is a genuine improvement over the old Boox Pen Plus, which, as you might know, I was never a huge fan of. The matte plastic finish on the Pen 3 feels much better in the hand and ditches that cheap feeling ripped plastic. Boox also added a really handy feature. There's now a storage spot for spare nibs hidden behind the cap at the top of the pen. That's definitely a nice touch. However, the Pen 3 still doesn't have an eraser on top, which is something I really appreciate on the Boox Pen 2 Pro, which is still my pen of choice simply because of that. The Pen 3's clip looks sleek, but isn't that useful. The magnetic cap is too weak to keep it secured under the folio strap, and a simple twist lock cap would have worked far better. You can twist the cap a bit to lock it, but the off-center spine makes it clear that's not by design. I'll come back to the writing feel in a moment, but first let's talk about the redesigned folio, which finally, thank God, has a cutout for the USB-C port. That might sound like a small thing, but always having to open the cover on the previous Note Air models just to plug in the tablet was annoying. So I'm really glad Boox listened to that feedback. They also improved how the folio folds. Instead of that slightly awkward setup from the old case, this one feels much more natural and works well in both portrait and landscape modes. The slightly textured, but still obviously synthetic exterior feels a bit nicer too. The only thing I don't like about the folio is how part of it just dangles when you flip it over. It doesn't really hurt usability, but there should have been magnets there as well. Another change is the strap. Boox replaced the permanently attached strap with the removable magnetic one. It's clearly meant to be a best of both worlds solution. A cleaner look for those who don't like straps, and still an option for those who do. In theory, that makes sense. But in practice, I never found it all that convenient with other Boox devices that have this feature, because what usually happens is those straps just end up flying around the room. Specs-wise, the Boox Note Air 5C is essentially the same device as the 4C. Same octa-core Snapdragon 690 chipset, 6 gigs of RAM, and 64 gigs of internal storage, of which 46 are actually usable. Interestingly enough, that's 9 gigs more of usable storage than the 4C offered. And you still can expand that with a micro SD card. so even huge content libraries aren't a problem. Decently loud stereo speakers, a built-in microphone, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth are all also part of the package. What's still missing though is any kind of ingress protection, and there are still no rubber feet on the back to keep the tablet from sliding around on the desk. That's something I'd really like to see Boox finally add in future models. Performance is excellent, and the tablet feels fast and responsive. Aside from the Boox Tab X C, I'd say it's one of the most responsive e-ink tablets you can get. That said, I did notice it's ever so slightly slower with certain PDF actions than the 4C. Boox did improve the BSR chip though, that's their proprietary screen refresh chip. I'll come back to that in a bit. The power button is still on top and doubles as a fingerprint sensor. It's flat and doesn't get in the way when changing the screen orientation, which is nice. And that brings us to the writing feel with the new paper-like screen texture. When you first get the Note Air 5C, I'd recommend gently scrubbing the screen with a microfiber cloth. My initial impression before doing that wasn't great because there's a bit of squeakiness to the film. Luckily, that went away after cleaning, and now the writing feel is actually really nice, with slightly more resistance than on previous Note Air models. That's not necessarily better, it comes down to personal preference. But the added friction does make writing feel a bit more analog. And even though we tend to call these textures paper-like, with the stylus, it feels more like using a felt tip pen than a pencil. But that's not unique to the Note Air 5C. It's common across many e-ink tablets. This screen texture is still a film layer on top of the glass, but it's not as easily removable as before. Peeling it off takes real effort, and you can't reapply it, so it's actually a completely new part compared to earlier generations. That analog writing feel is reinforced by the excellent pen latency, which is now even lower than on the already great Note Air 4C. Measured in ultra slow motion at just 16 milliseconds, the 5C is 20% quicker than its predecessor and offers the lowest latency I've seen in any e-ink tablet this size. The only one I've measured that's faster is its larger sibling, the Boox Tab X C. But the 5C is actually a bit more accurate than the Tab X C, because it's still using EMR technology. So you don't get those wobbly diagonal lines you typically see with capacitive styluses. The pen-to-pixel distance, on the other hand, is basically the same as before. Not super close, like on tablets without a Frontlight, but absolutely fine, and better than on the old Kindle Scribe, for example. So in short, writing on the Note Air 5C feels fantastic. It's a step up from the already great writing performance of the Note Air 4C, and I'd say it's the best Boox has released in this size segment so far, both in terms of writing feel and pure writing performance. And that brings us to the display. There's a lot to unpack here, because it offers some welcome surprises, even though the 5C still uses the same e-ink Kaleido 3 technology. Just to recap, this type of color e-ink works by combining a regular black and white e-ink panel with an RGB color filter that's printed directly onto the screen. By carefully positioning the pixels, it darkens specific areas under the red, green, or blue subpixels to only reflect the needed colors, making them visible to the naked eye. As you can see under the microscope, to generate the color red, the e-ink screen underneath the green and blue subpixels is darkened. It's a clever solution that allows the Note Air 5C to display up to 4096 colors, which is especially useful for viewing images, charts, or graphs, and also for note-taking. That approach results in two distinct resolutions, 300 ppi for black and white content and 150 ppi for colors, because the e-ink pixels need to be smaller than the color pixels for this solution to work. And as always, there are some trade-offs. The colors on the Boox Note Air 5C are also muted, same as on any other Kaleido 3 display. So this is not a vibrant LCD style display. And compared to a pure black and white e-ink panel, with the Frontlight off, the screen appears darker. And if you look closely, especially at around 30 centimeters or 12 inches and closer, you'll notice a slight grain produced by the tiny RGB subpixels. But honestly, at the end of the day, I still think those compromises are worth it if you're looking at colored content. Once you stop comparing it to traditional LCD or OLED tablets, you quickly get used to the pastel-like colors. And when you turn up the Frontlight to at least 30 to 40 nits and view it at a normal reading distance, the other downsides mostly fade into the background. So bottom line, don't get a color e-ink tablet if you don't need the colors, but absolutely have a look if you do. Because color doesn't just make the experience feel more modern, it genuinely adds utility. Charts, illustrations, and even simple UI elements in apps are easier to navigate and understand. In many cases, images or graphs that are hard or even impossible to interpret on a grayscale e-ink display suddenly make sense. Comparing the Boox Note Air 5C to the 4C, 3C, and Tab X C, there are plenty of similarities, but also a few key differences worth pointing out. all of them use Kaleido 3. So using these tablets indoors without the Frontlight just isn't a great experience. Turning on the built-in LEDs and setting brightness to around 40 nits improves readability across the board. Among them, the Boox Tab X C, which is also the most expensive, has the most vivid colors. They're still muted as you'd expect from e-ink Kaleido, but the difference is noticeable compared to the smaller Boox tablets. Between the 5C and the 4C, the color difference is very subtle. In fact, side by side with typical colored content, it's hard to spot the difference with the naked eye. But compared to the older 3C, the improvement is much more obvious. Using a spectrophotometer to measure color vividness makes those differences clearer. These normalized values just show how close each color gets to its theoretical maximum. 100% means it's as vivid as that color can be. And in case you're wondering why some colors don't quite match the numbers, I measured with the Frontlight off. But what you're seeing on camera has the Frontlight on, which shifts the white point due to its brightness and color temperature. Plus, depending on the angle and distance to the studio lights, the colors can look a bit different too. The Note Air 3C's Frontlight tops out at 40 nits, the Tab X C and the Note Air 4C both manage around 65 to 70 nits on average. But the Note Air 5C outshines them all, literally, with a maximum average brightness of around 101 nits. That kind of boost wasn't really needed over the 4C, but it's definitely nice to have. Better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. And with that brighter Frontlight, the 5C's background starts to look truly paper white. It enhances contrast and makes colors pop just a little more, to the point where I actually had to adjust my camera settings, since they weren't calibrated for a display this bright. That higher brightness does come with a slightly more noticeable brightness gradient, but if you just dial the Frontlight down a bit, it's pretty much a non-issue in everyday use, especially for full-page colored content, where it's virtually invisible. So even considering that, there's no question. The Boox Note Air 5C has the best looking, most versatile e-ink Kaleido 3 display in the 10-inch size segment so far. And of course, you can also adapt the color temperature from cold white to warm orange to reduce blue light exposure. That of course will change how the colors look, but it's a very nice feature to improve reading comfort at night nonetheless. And since this is e-ink, the display is perfectly readable in direct sunlight. In fact, the Kaleido 3 display actually works even better outdoors because colors appear more saturated with all that light. I'd say the most welcome surprise is the much improved ghosting behavior on the Note Air 5C. Using the built-in reading app and looking at comics or other colored content makes that immediately clear. Where the Note Air 4C required some tinkering with the e-ink settings to get good results, the 5C is almost free of ghosting. Even looking closely, it's often hard to spot. And it's not just better with the default reading app, it's improved in other apps too. Not as much, but still noticeable. Watching videos makes the improvement more obvious. But that's not really the main use case for an e-ink tablet. Still, it's a great showcase for just how good the ghosting performance really is. But just to be clear, there's still ghosting, but with the right node and settings, it's generally less pronounced than with the previous generations. Which brings us to the improved e-ink mode switch. Boox has completely overhauled the e-ink center to make it easier to understand and navigate. Instead of offering 4 or 5 different modes, they've simplified it to just HD and speed, with Regal mode occasionally showing up. There are still plenty of options for tweaking how apps work with the e-ink screen, but by simplifying the available choices, it's generally a better experience, and it reduces the learning curve for first-time Boox users. Some settings are a bit better hidden, and if you don't know where to look, you might miss them, because they show up contextually based on the app you're in, like the animation filter. There is one thing I do miss from the old system though, the app overview in the settings. Previously, you could see e-ink settings for each app, which made it easy to make changes without opening the app itself. It wasn't something I used often, but it came in handy. Hopefully Boox will bring that back. Power users might also miss the more granular refresh options, but honestly, I don't miss them after a while, because I never found anything other than HD or the old ultra-fast mode all that useful. And that's essentially what you get now. Speed mode is still fast and lets you even watch videos reasonably well. The improvements to the e-ink center are echoed throughout the user interface. Boox continues to simplify menus mainly by adding predefined options that can be customized if needed. For the most part, these changes work well, but it can also be a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's quick and easy to switch between available options, like text styling in eBooks or viewing modes in PDFs. But on the other, it introduces extra layers of menus, which can feel like a lot. Still, I think the approach works well, especially for new users who don't need to see every option up front. The Boox Note Air 5C now runs Android 15, so Boox actually skipped Android 14 and released the most up-to-date Android version they've ever published, if I'm not mistaken. It even comes with the October 2025 security patch, which is awesome. But since the user interface is still heavily customized for e-ink and includes many of Boox's own solutions, you don't see a lot of the changes from recent Android versions, and it's definitely not a typical Android experience. Despite the company introducing many improvements, there's still a steeper learning curve here than on, say, a remarkable Paper Pro or Kindle Scribe, and depending on the UI language, you'll most likely also encounter some odd translations. That said, having Android 15 does make the Note Air 5C the most future-proof Boox tablet you can get right now, simply because apps will support this Android version for many years to come. Speaking of apps, you can easily install them via the integrated Google Play Store, just like any Android tablet. Sideloading APK files is of course also possible, which as a side note might see some big changes with future Android versions, because Google seems to want to lock down the operating system further. That's not just bad news for e-ink tablets, but for any Android device. But for now, sideloading still works. And because most apps aren't optimized for e-ink screens, the available e-ink modes I mentioned earlier are helpful to improve the experience. But honestly, most of the time, there's no need to tweak anything. Most apps just work right out of the box. The built-in note-taking app has also seen some great improvements, making it arguably the most powerful note-taking option in the e-ink space. It offers everything: different pen types with pressure and tilt sensitivity where it makes sense, colors, predefined templates, and you can add your own layers, shapes, text recognition with handwriting search, audio recording, a table of contents function, and now even customizable and resizable toolbar options. You can now set up and save your own toolbar configurations to switch between quickly. You can drag the toolbar to different positions and hide or show it with a gesture, all of which is super convenient. Another great addition is infinite notes. These let you scroll in any direction and expand the canvas as much as you need. So whatever you're working on, a mind map, notes, a sketch, you can just keep adding space.
I do have two issues with the feature though, and they go hand in hand. I would have preferred to see the infinite notes as part of the regular handwritten notes, instead of a separate note type. Right now, infinite notes are always a one-pager, which does limit the options a bit.
But then again, you can use the margins function to enlarge handwritten notes as well, just not as conveniently as with infinite notes. Or another option would be to create an infinite note for a specific content and use the interlinking feature to connect it with the handwritten notebook it belongs to. So as you can see, the Boox note-taking features are not always the most intuitive to use, but they certainly are the most powerful at this point. You can export your notes locally in different file formats and sizes, and you can also sync your notes with an Onyx account, with the option to choose between US, European, and default Boox servers. Onyx Boox states they adhere to the European data privacy protection laws if you're in the EU, and you have to agree to that when setting up the tablet. What I'd still like to see is an option to completely opt out of any tracking. Like other Boox devices I've tested, the Note Air 5C occasionally connects to Chinese servers, which I don't see a good reason for if you're not using any cloud services or checking for updates. But to be fair, that's not unique to Boox. Android in general is pretty chatty on any device. So if you're concerned about privacy, I'd recommend using a software firewall. Another area where Boox easily leads the e-ink field is PDF functionality, with different viewing modes to make navigating PDFs seamless. The columns mode is my personal favorite. It makes multi-column A4 or letter-sized documents so much easier to read. Enable it, and you zoom in on one part of the page, jumping from segment to segment without having to manually pan around. Boox also brought those new UI adaptations I mentioned earlier to the PDF viewer, so you can create themes and quickly switch between the modes you use most. It takes a little getting used to if you're coming from the old system, but it definitely adds convenience. You can annotate PDFs directly with the pen, no file conversion needed. Just write on the page, and when you're done, you can copy the PDF from the internal storage and continue working with those annotations on your computer.
So in short, this is hands down the best PDF functionality you can get on e-ink right now. And it's not even close. And the added color, even though it's muted, makes reading PDFs with graphs and images much better. Of course, you can also read comics and ebooks, all of which also benefit from the reduced ghosting. I know I'm repeating myself, but less ghosting really is a big deal on Kaleido 3 and just makes the user experience better. The ebook library offers useful filtering and sorting options, and the reading app provides all the important features. Multiple options to personalize text styling, taking notes with the stylus or virtual QWERTY keyboard, and looking up words in the dictionary.
By default, it uses an online dictionary for definitions, but you can use local dictionaries too, though you still have to sideload those yourself, which can be a pain to source. Boox has reworked the text styling options a while back to look a lot like what you get on Kindles. You can change the styling and save it as a theme, making it quick and easy to switch between different setups. There's also a very nice text-to-speech function that uses the default Android speech synthesis. It doesn't sound as good as a professionally recorded audiobook, of course, but it's useful if you want to keep reading while you can't look at the screen. I imagine it could be helpful for learning to read too. You can download different voices, languages, and even dialects. Let's hear how that sounds.
Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and, to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained.
In my writing robot test, the 3700 mAh battery lasted about 9 hours of continuous handwriting with the Frontlight off, which is actually quite good and on par with the 4C. But since using the Frontlight is practically a must with e-ink Kaleido 3 indoors, the more realistic figure is around 6 hours of writing time at 40 nits. That's what you can expect in typical daily use and is pretty much in line with the predecessor. Where it starts to differ noticeably is when you crank up the Frontlight to full brightness, with that number dropping to just over 4 hours, really showing how much more power that brighter Frontlight consumes. Testing battery performance for reading turned out to be trickier than expected. I noticed the battery didn't drain at a consistent rate, it dropped more slowly at higher percentages and then a bit faster toward the end. So just extrapolating from a short test window gave me inconsistent results. In the end, I had to let the tests run for many more hours, and even got a second device, just to make sure the numbers I was seeing were actually accurate. In short, I got around 30 hours of reading time with the Frontlight off, a page turn every 15 seconds, and a full page refresh every 5 pages, down from about 35 to 40 hours on the 4C. Not a dramatic drop, but the difference was consistent across multiple tests. With the Frontlight set to 40 nits, which, as I mentioned, is really needed to read comfortably on e-ink Kaleido 3 indoors, battery life dropped to around 14 hours. And if you really want to drain the battery fast, just fire up a YouTube video with the Frontlight at max brightness. That'll empty the battery in about 2.5 hours. Obviously, not a typical use case for an e-ink device, but it's a helpful way to show what happens under extreme conditions.
And that brings us to the conclusion, which, to be honest, sounds a lot like last year's review of the 4C. On paper, the Boox Note Air 5C looks like a minor update. But once again, it's the sum of its parts that makes this a meaningful step forward. The biggest improvement over the 4C is the reduced ghosting. That alone makes viewing color content much more enjoyable, especially full color pages in comics and magazines. Add to that the brighter Frontlight, partially more vivid colors, a nicer feeling pen, the addition of hardware buttons, lower writing latency, a more textured screen surface, and Android 15, and you've got a tablet that, despite my initial skepticism, won me over. I started this review wondering why Boox would again release a device with such seemingly incremental changes, but once I used it, the answer was obvious. But of course, where there's praise, there should be room for critique. The way the pen magnetically attaches, best when overlapping with the volume down button, is just odd. The clip feels unnecessary, the magnetic strap can be frustrating, and the way the folio dangles when flipped over, that's just sloppy. But the thing is, these are minor annoyances, and in day-to-day use, most of them fade into the background.
I'd say the only real downside of the Note Air 5C, and to be fair, it's still relatively minor, is battery life. It's slightly worse than on the 4C, and it's one of the few things that can actually impact day-to-day use in a more meaningful way.
But it also depends on how you use the device, especially if you're cranking the Frontlight to full brightness. Personally, I'm glad Boox didn't artificially cap the brightness to save battery. I'd rather have the extra brightness when I need it. So if you're looking for a do-it-all color e-ink tablet with great handwriting performance, full Android support, and excellent flexibility, the Boox Note Air 5C once again raises the bar in its category. It doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, but it does what it does very well. But should you upgrade if you already have a Note Air 4C? Only if ghosting is a real issue for you. Otherwise, I'd recommend skipping this one because the 4C is still an excellent e-ink tablet. If you're coming from a 3C, however, the upgrade makes a lot more sense. And if you're still unsure which color e-ink tablet to get, especially with strong competitors like the Tab X C and the remarkable Paper Pro, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss my upcoming comparison. Thanks for watching, I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.